John Cumbler is an environmental historian whose studies explore the human impact on the natural world over long periods of time. Most of us, I suspect, never think about how our own surroundings have been shaped by human activity. We look at the stunted forests of Nova Scotia, for example, and assume that tall trees can't grow there, but they did before our ancestors cut them down. We think the white bear is a polar animal, but it once bred as far down the coast as the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Cumbler taught for most of his life at the University of Louisville, Kentucky, but he now lives on Cape Cod, Massachusetts, where he serves as a trained rescuer of whales, dolphins, and sea turtles. The most recent of his 7 books is a 400-year environmental history of Cape Cod. He's also an historian of social movements, starting with the Abolitionists, who created the very first large altruistic social movement, and tracing the way that the abolitionists' victory over slavery ultimately produced movements dedicated to women's rights, workers' rights, the right to a decent living, decent housing, and a healthy environment. These are stories about how we've done things wrong, and also about how we've done things right. This is a history that we really need to know.
I didn't start academically as an environmentalist. I started really as a labor social historian. But because I was an avid, since a little teeny kid, fisherman and I guess you would call outdoors kind of kid, I became more and more involved in the concerns over the environment and politically. And then increasingly I thought, what can I bring to the environmental movement besides, my body and demonstrations and things? And it seems to me my historical skills, and that's what got me into environmental history. And the Cape was a sort of natural for me to end my career.
You go back to the civil rights movement. I mean, you were active in social movements right back to that. I'm fascinated with the environmental history thing. I don't think, we've done about 100 of these interviews now, and I don't think any of them has been with an environmental historian. It's not a common kind of field, but one of the things that we've hit over and over again, it's kind of like a subterranean theme in a lot of this discussion, is what Daniel Pauly calls shifting baselines. That you're born in a certain place, and you look around and you think that's the way it always was, and you have no sense at all that you're in the flow of time, and that this place was once quite different.
I'll tell you just a funny little vignette about that struck me, is when we first moved to the Cape, which was 38 years ago or 35 years ago, something like that. We used to drive from our town, well, you know the Cape, so from Wellfleet up to Provincetown it's a more happening place. And as you drive, we used to take the back roads up, and it was just as far as you could see, just clear, just absolutely clear. And over the years, that's all grown up and been reforested. So there's only a few patches left of that open Cape that I remember, when we first moved. And I was for a while thinking, without thinking about it, just like, that's the Cape. The original Cape is being lost to this new growth forest. Only to realize, of course, what I thought of as the original Cape is not original at all. It's a product of the 19th century, because in the 18th century this was forested. And there's another sort of thing about that. You drive along Route 6, which is the main thing, and there are these areas you can pull off to park. And my wife said the other day, she said, why would anyone pull off to park there? Because there's nothing. There's not even a bathroom. It's just a pull over to park. There's nothing there. And I said, when they built the highway, those pull-offs had views to the bay. But it's all reforested. So now they're just like, people pull off to throw their garbage out or something. Anyway, so that's what I guess is changing.
Yeah, and you really are shocked sometimes when you realize just how fluid a place can be in the flow of time. And I think that's kind of important because, and then you start to say, we want to preserve. Well, what are you preserving?
What are we preserving? What do we want to preserve?
And if you say, I want it in its original condition, what does that mean? It's been in many original conditions, right? So is it fair to see environmental history as an attempt to counteract that very human tendency to think that the way you saw it first is the way it always was?
I think environmental history, for me, there's sort of three things environmental history does. One is to get us a certain sense out of the present, to see how, as you say, things are changing all the time. And what we think of as normal today, in fact, is the product of today and not necessarily normal. It's also, I think, to get us to appreciate how human interactions with the environment have changed the environment, and how the changing environment has affected how humans interact with it. That you don't really get that sense when you look at the present, but when you look over a space of 300 or 400 years, you begin to see how both humans are, which we all understand. I mean, anyone, except for maybe Donald Trump, global warming is happening. Humans are creating it, but it's also as important to realize humans create change in a context that limits and affects how they change, how humans are able to change that past, that nature has its impact on how we use and abuse it. And that's, I think, something that environmental history helps us perceive.
It's quite fascinating because we don't tend to think of ourselves as being situated in time. We think of ourselves as situated in space more. But one of the things that it seems to me, I'm interested if you'd agree with this, in our lifetime, and we're roughly the same age, I'm a little older, but in our lifetime, I think we've moved from a sense that human beings were too puny, in effect, to have any real impact on the world around us. And we've had to move to the point where we realize that we have become the dominant factor in shaping the world around us.
As anthropologists are saying, we've left the Holocene period and gone to the Anthropocene period, because we now live in an epic, one of these, thousands of years epics in which humans are dictating the nature of, or how the world is evolving, more than being responsive to that changing world. I mean, when you think of, humans had to respond to the Little Ice Age. Humans had to respond to the original Ice Age. Humans, had to make adjustments of where they lived and what they did. Now we're having to respond, we hope, to the world that we've effectively created. I mean, obviously that's always been the case, and since we built shelters and we dammed rivers and did that, but not to the scale. It's just so dramatically different. And I think, we can sort of see that if you think of, say, until what I said, the age of coal, pretty much nature dictated how we got where we went, right? I mean, it was, you're a sailor.
Yeah.
When the wind blows, when it doesn't blow. I mean, I was reading through records of people who were sailing, taking the packet boats from the Cape to Boston and back, which were fairly regular, but how long it took could vary from a day to several days, depending on the winds, and the flow of the river, and whether there was ice, whether you could go or not. But after the age of coal, pretty much we could go where we wanted to go, when we wanted to go. And I think where we are now is we've all of a sudden understood that triumph over nature is coming back to bite us.
Yeah, and it's affecting us very much. I mean, I think if people have an apprehension of how that, or a sense of how that actually operates, they probably think of it in global terms, global warming and sea level and, ocean acidification and stuff. But you've also been pointing here, it's very local as well. It's not just these great big ones, right?
Yeah, no, and I think it is in local in ways we don't perceive it day to day, but when we look at it over a longer period of time, we can certainly begin to see how it affects, farming in Michigan and the dead area in the Gulf of Mexico and things like that.
And then you've done a very extensive study of Cape Cod over a period of 400 years. Tell me what you've learned from that, or maybe tell me a bit about the story of how the Cape has evolved over those 400 years.
I picked the Cape partly because I live there and I love it, but also because it's a very fragile piece of land. It's a sand spit that was left by the glacier. So I think it gives us because it's such a delicate piece of land, and it's a very contained piece of land, it sort of becomes a microcosm that we can see what's happening, and we'll have to extrapolate from it, but I do think it helps tell a tale that's very important. So it starts with a very new piece of land. I mean, it was basically deposited by the glacier, and within a few hundred years was colonized by plants and sea animals, and then marshes developed. So that all happened fairly quickly by geological terms. And humans arrived, Native Americans, fairly early on as well. But the nature of the estuaries, all estuaries are incredibly prolific, so it provided a good place for people to live. Because, I mean, the problem with any human interaction with the natural world is you're taking resources out when you put them in your body or use them to build your house and things, and you have to somehow replace them, or they have to have, So the advantage of the estuaries is that replacement is brought in by the seas themselves. That is, the constant tidal flows are bringing in new nutrients and everything. So as humans, you can harvest out of that system shellfish and fish and plants and everything without seriously depleting the system, because it gets constantly re-nourished. So for several thousands of years, humans were able to live on the Cape without having a very big impact on it. I mean, they did change it. They did a lot of burning, which affected the forest cover, so that the Cape was mostly forested with pitch pine, which is fire resistant, partly because of the fact that Native Americans were using fire to control the environment. Then, with the introduction of white settlement in the 17th century, we got a different use of the land and the land resources, and that was much more intense extraction of nutrients out of the soil, the wood, the forests, and the fish. And that period lasted for basically about 350 years until it collapsed, until the extractive practices of humans, both fishing, farming, cutting of wood for heating homes, as building boats and fences and this, that, and the other, really created an ecological crisis on the Cape, and it drove, we just mined the Cape out, and fishing collapsed, farming collapsed. A lot of the industries that were needed wood, like salt making and boat building and things like that, collapsed. And the Cape went through a period of about 80 years of recession, depression, lost population, lost, people, towns, withered up, wharfs decayed. And then in the 20th century, the Cape refound a new economy, which was in tourism and visitors. And we've been living on that economy now for a little over 100 years. But that's beginning to take its toll on the environment as well. And I think looking back over past uses might give us some indication that we should be careful of what we do in the future.
You've said something here that the economics of tourism is growth-based. It doesn't have to be, but it is right now. And it seems to me that the first part of that sentence says we haven't learned anything, and the second part of that sentence says that there is something to be learned. Is that right?
I think you're absolutely, that we haven't learned. But we need to learn, and I think partly that was why I believed, and I guess everybody who writes a book, as you must know, feels you're going to make a big impact. That was one of the things I hope people would take out of my book, is that we really need to seriously pay attention to what we're doing. And there are lessons in the past of where people had. I mean, at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, there were an awful lot of restraints on what people could do on the land passed by the local towns and the state legislature. But in the boom years of the 19th century, people forgot those restraints, and sort of the mantra became, how much can we gain from mining the resources of the environment, rather than how should we husband these resources to protect what we have. So I think we should understand we have to learn from the past, but we also can find lessons in the past to think about how we need to approach the future.
One of the lessons seems to be that you can't be sustainable and grow continuously.
I think you can, well, you have to be very careful about, and it's a cliche, careful growth, but you have to be careful how you grow. And you have to be mindful of, and I guess my lesson from the past is you have to be mindful of who benefits and who doesn't benefit. That we can limit our growth on the Cape in one way, where the Cape becomes sort of a museum for the wealthy. But do we want to? Is that what we want? We have to be very careful that in limiting growth, we don't privilege one group of people against other groups of people, and that's even the more difficult task. I mean, it's a difficult task to limit growth because the economics are just driving against it. I mean, I gave a presentation once when I said, basically, the market works against the environment, and you got to admit to that and understand that. In the case of the Cape, the driving market force, which is, I think, one of the most dangerous things happening at the Cape, is there's a limited amount of land, and the price of land goes up. And as the price of land goes up, the smaller, less intensive uses of that land get pushed aside by more value, higher use value for the land. So smaller cottages get replaced by bigger, fancier homes. Little motels get replaced by large hotels, and small, crab shacks get replaced with big fancy restaurants. I mean, that's as the price of land goes up, that's what drives everything else. So we could restrain how people use the land, but we have to be very careful that in protecting the land, we don't basically force the price of what isn't protected even higher. And then that squeezes out people who we may want to have access to this resource.
Well, and people who shape the place, I mean, people, there's a culture on Cape Cod that's quite particular and as salty as can be, and that disappears in favor of it becoming a playground for the wealthy.
That's true.
There's a conservation loss just in terms of human diversity. Right?
Human diversity is a big issue. And who's going to work in the restaurants and the hotels and things like that? I mean, if we don't pay attention to those issues, we could live in a kind of apartheid state where the wealthy live on the Cape and then bus in people from off Cape to do the basic services on the Cape. I don't want to live in that community. There are people who don't care. I mean, and the problem for the Cape is to convince those people that that's not where they want to live.
But it's also very insidious with the people that you actually want to keep on the Cape, because from their perspective, this is all great. The value of their property has just been going up like crazy, and they can cash out at some time and go and live in Plymouth or somewhere,
And it's there is a sort of a old timers versus new timers conflict. But that's beginning more and more to sort of splinter apart, because a bunch of the old timers are all of a sudden going, wait a minute, my children can't live here anymore if this keeps going on. And then the question is, how do I deal with that? Do I just say, I'll sell for the highest price I can and move off and my kids can live in Wareham or someplace? Or do I want to get involved in organizations that are trying to, protect affordable housing as well as open spaces? And I think that's happening increasingly on the Cape, that the old timers versus new timers division is breaking apart. And the new timers are different, because there's the retirees who have a long-term investment in the Cape, and increasingly people on the Cape who are not just summer people, they're weekend people. I mean, there are houses not far from where I live. I call them single-family hotels. They're these immense structures that are obscene, from my point of view, in and of themselves, and use an immense amount of resources. I mean, it may be the latest in insulation and everything, but they've got all this electronics on all the time, and they kept heated all the time, and they're used for 3 or 4 weekends a year, and empty the rest of the time. I mean, people can afford to do that. Now, here's the rub. You're a local, and your kid goes to the local school. You're a fisher, an oysterman, for example. It's a big industry, and I have a lot of friends who are oystermen. Your kid gets to go to one of the best schools in the state of Massachusetts, which in the state is one of the best school systems in the country, because of that mansion. Because that mansion pays property tax, and that property tax maintains one of the best schools. So that's another dilemma. Like, I may not like it, the fact that there used to be a cottage up there that my kid could live in, but I certainly love it that my kid gets to go to the best school in the state of Massachusetts, or one of the best, because of those houses.
It's very complex.
Yeah, it is.
And the same thing is true, I think. I mean, this is another way in which the Cape is perhaps a microcosm or a model. The same sort of thing is true in a place like Vancouver, BC.
Oh, absolutely. I went to a conference out there, and I was like, oh my goodness, what's happening to this town?
Same thing, I grew up there. There's no way I could afford to live in the house that my brother is in, and that's the case with an entire generation of Vancouver-based people. They can no longer afford to live in their own city.
And it's also happening, it's not just, but all over the world. The Cape kind of experience. I mean, I've seen it happen in Sardinia and in the coast of Italy, and obviously the coast of Spain. It's how we manage to protect what we love so much. What Leopold said, we can love nature to death by our consumption. If we start just consuming nature, or the natural world, and I'm just talking about the beauty of it, because we're talking about a vacation place in the case of the Cape. We can, like anything, you can consume it till it's destroyed. And we have to figure out how to appreciate it and protect it while we appreciate it. And I think that's very difficult. But if we don't have the big picture, I don't think we can do it.
I think you're right. And I think one of the things that's been slowly borne in on me as we've done all these interviews with people like yourself, the very badge of wealth is waste, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, that house you're describing is waste. It's right. It has resources that could be housing 20 people full-time, and so does one family for a few weekends. That's a micro-status, that you're able to waste things, that you're able to turn in your car every few years, that you're able to burn off power and not think twice about it, and so on and so forth. And I don't know how you change that, but it certainly is one of the hallmarks of wealth these days.
Well, one of the things I keep coming back to is it wasn't always that way. I mean, I think we can see a moment in American history that basically, this is the U.S., Canada has a slightly different take on things, in many ways better, but not completely. But there was that moment in the 1820s and 30s and 40s when what people aspired to was no longer what they referred to in the early 19th century as competence. That is, if you were a family on the Cape in 1800, what you aspired to was to have shelter for your family, food on the table, and to be able to pass that on to your children. But in the 1820s and 30s and 40s, increasingly, the measure of success was not your ability to pass on competence to your children, but your ability to pass on more to your children than you had, and that the assumption is that they would have more, so greater wealth, greater, I'm not saying no individual wanted more before that, but as a culture, we embrace this idea of progress meant more, and more wealth, and more, the utilization of more resources. And that's the paradigm that we're still caught in. But I think we should, in the case of the Cape, we should start rethinking about competence, that maybe we don't need to have more. Maybe, we can live more moderately and still live comfortably. I admit that I like to live somewhat ruggedly, sometimes more ruggedly than my wife would like me to live, or us to live. But we don't have to live uncomfortably with a lot less than what we do. I think serious evaluations of what do we need to live comfortably.
Yeah, but we lived quite comfortably in the 1940s when we, as a culture, had something like a third of the wealth that we now have, and it wasn't uncomfortable. Everybody had, I shouldn't say everybody did, but the whole concept of enough has gone away, hasn't it?
And when we think about a home, for example, the energy efficiencies that we have developed are just amazing in terms of insulation, in terms of this, that, and the other. But the average home is still consuming so much resources because its size has grown so much larger, that the family expects so much more space now than they did 50 years ago. So that we may have added all these efficiencies, but many of those efficiencies are being dissipated, in a sense, by more space, many more rooms, many more bathrooms, et cetera, et cetera. Do we need that?
Well, now you said earlier that when I suppose the crisis of consumption of the industrial period earlier in the Cape's history kind of came to a head, there were steps that people took and lessons that they learned that perhaps would apply here.
I think there are, I think yes and no. I think partly what happened in at the beginning of the 20th century was that the environmental crisis that basically stretched over three-quarters of a century hurt, and people were upset about the fact the fishing fleets were coming back with much less fish, and the farms were being destroyed, et cetera, et cetera. But when the tourist industry started to take over at the beginning of the 20th century, people came to see tourism as a solution to the problems of their environmental destruction, without really investigating the the forces behind the environmental destruction. So the forests regrew on the Cape. So it looked like it was recovering. With the change in sport fishing became, fishermen used to complain about tuna fish and bluefish. They were destructive fish. They hated them because they wrecked their nets. And then all of a sudden they realized there's a market for this, and people will pay good money to go out fishing for bluefish and tuna fish. But I think that the success of the tourist industry at the beginning of the 20th century and up and through basically I think till about 1970, blinded people to the fact that tourism has an environmental cost too, especially in terms of water and water quality, which is where we're beginning to see it most dramatically. And I think now we're beginning to say, wait a minute, we need to think about the environmental costs of tourism. What does it mean to accommodate all these people on highways? That doesn't mean for building more highways. What does it mean when we have all these motels which all have to have heated swimming pools and fescue grass that gets fertilized and pesticides and all that. So I think that we're beginning to think about it, but I think we've got to put our heads together because as we talked about before, economics is driving this, and that's a hard thing to come to terms with.
It looked like clean, benign development, right?
Exactly. For 30 years, it looked like this was it.
Perhaps it was, too, given the scale that it was at. And I remember there was a wonderful phrase for the very modest motels of my youth, and what were they called? They weren't called cabins, but they were called something like that,
There were these little teeny cottages, and the Cape had dozens of them. These little teeny cottages. They'd have just, poverty grass is what Thoreau called it, out front, just the little beach grass, sand driveways and things, and people would come and park and, have minimal accommodations there.
Motor court. Motor court was one word for them, but there was another one that's escaping me. But but that kind of tourism probably isn't that damaging.
It isn't, and but those places are few and far between now on the Cape because, again, price of land is so high, and you put a structure on it, you have to pay for the cost of the land. So you're going to charge, making up a figure, $150 a night to stay there. Well, if you're going to spend $150 a night, you don't want, the cold shower in the back of the cottage. You want, a swimming pool and, nice grass and all the accommodations you expect for $150 a night. And that changes what motels are putting.
So what's the impact on the water? You said that's where the stress is first sort of showing itself seriously.
Yeah, I think in many ways it's the canary in the mine for the Cape, and because the Cape is on one single aquifer for the whole Cape, and pollutants move into the aquifer very slowly, which is good, but the downside of that is they move out of the aquifer very slowly. So for years, the Air Force Base, at the base of the camp, was using de-icers and doing training exercises where they use flame retardants and things like that, which they would just wash away. Well, those have been washed into the soil. They seep through the soil and they're going into the aquifer. And now we have these toxic plumes beginning to spread out from places like Otis Air Force Base, but also we have town dumps along the Cape that had dumped, they were just sand pits where they just filled up garbage. Now, since the EPA and the Clean Water Act, they've had to clean up those dumps, but they still have toxic fumes flowing out from those dumps. On top of that, you have one of the problems with the high cost of housing on the Cape is that labor is very expensive. So one of the things that we've done in this country is replace labor with chemical inputs. So instead of hiring people to weed your garden, you dump Roundup on it, and people want green lawns as opposed to poverty grass. So to get green lawn on a sandy soil, you have to put a lot of fertilizer and a lot of herbicides and whatever. All that then percolates down, or I guess it doesn't percolate, it leaches down into the aquifer. and it stays there. And that's a big problem. And that the nitrates particularly, I mean, the Cape is, a lot of the homes are septic systems. Now, septic systems can, I mean, there are septic systems that remove nitrates, but most septic systems remove bacteria, but not the nitrates. The nitrates just go into the soil. And they're seeping into the water, which is seeping into the streams, so we're beginning to get algae blooms in our ponds because of the excessive nitrates that are coming in. We're having problems with our coastal areas because excessive nitrates are leading to algae blooms, which are leading to depletions of oxygen. So I think it's sort of the, as I said, the canary in the mine to what's going on. That there's a lot of problems with development on fragile ecosystems. Well, development anywhere, but you on the Cape, I think the water system is going to be the first thing that rings the bell for.
So what do you do then? You quote the change of outlook in the past very positively, saying that the prominent people in the Cape decided that the common good needs to be defended as aggressively as the individual's rights. And it sounds to me as though that's a realization that came along at a certain point in time, got overwhelmed, and now needs to come back. Do you see it coming back?
I do see it coming back. I think I do see it. We've a lot of citizen groups on the Cape, and it's an interesting group of people that are coming together. A lot of the retirees to the Cape have time on their hands, so, and skills, and they want to protect the Cape. You have some old-time Cape families that are worried about what's happening to the Cape, that are involved in this, and some new families that are moving to the Cape just, you know, because of the beauty and opening up restaurants or, you know, bed and breakfast things, and then they are also becoming active. And so there's organizations that are springing up at the town level. The Cape, the governing structure of the Cape is heavily weighed toward town governance. So we're getting a lot of, you know, well, I can give you an example. Due to federal legislation, the towns all the towns on the Cape were required to create conservation commissions to protect the coastal areas and wetlands as part of the Wetland Protection Act and things. Most of those early commissions basically were staffed by real estate interests and development interests and somebody's cousin and that sort of thing, and basically didn't do anything. And the rule of thumb was fill first, ask for permission second. But increasingly, people who are going on to those commissions, and there's a lot of work, those commissions, you make a lot of enemies when you say to your neighbor, you can't do that, are taking very serious the charge of protecting the wetlands in the coastal areas. And that's, I can see that change over the past 25 years, where the conservation commissions are now increasingly across the Cape being personed by people who are dedicated to protecting rather than advancing development. And they're making enemies doing it too. I mean, that's a reality. There's also town people involved in open spaces. Towns are using town resources to buy land, to protect land. At the same time, these towns have committees on affordable housing that are trying to do what they can to maintain affordable housing for the people that live in these towns. You get regional associations involved. You get cooperations between the Park Service, which is a big landowner in the sense of the Cape, the Audubon, which is a big landowner in the Outer Cape. Yeah, they own a big chunk of land. The Massachusetts, not the national, the Massachusetts Audubon Society has, and they run a lot of wonderful programs, of which I'm involved in some, like the sea turtle rescue program and things. and education programs and all that. But they're also involved in working with the communities to protect the natural resources, the association to protect Cape Cod, and the Chamber of Commerce is increasingly, and the Chamber of Commerce has an interesting history, because you think of the Chamber of Commerce as booster development, which, in a certain sense they were. But back in the 1920s, the Chamber first raised the alarm: we have to be careful or we'll develop ourselves into destruction. And they kind of lost that vision in the 40s and 50s, but they've restarted to think about controlling development to be more environmentally benign, what they call a blue economy. So a lot of groups are coming up, even groups that you wouldn't expect, as the case of the Chamber, who are starting to say, we've got to think about this. The problem is, the forces of development are so powerful, the forces of the economy are so powerful, and the solutions require a lot of sacrifice for people that people are reluctant to do, and a lot of creative thinking that, we really have to put our heads together and think very creatively to solve a problem that, on the face of it, is intractable.
It's almost been an intellectual war against the very concept of the common good over the last sort of 40 or 50 years, right?
Yes, absolutely. It comes and goes. I think it was very strong in the end of the 18th, the beginning of the 19th century. It waned, came back again at the beginning of the 20th century, waned again in the teens and 20s, came back again in the 30s, and then sort of in the 50s and 60s got pushed back down. And I'm hoping we're going to see it reassert itself, because I think without that commitment to the common will, as they used to say, we're in trouble.
And it's actually better for you as an individual if your community is healthy and prosperous. It's in many respects more important to you than your own individual welfare.
I certainly believe that, but a lot of people don't. And,
So there's an education job to do.
Well, I'll give you an example of what just drove me crazy once. I was in a meeting about what was called the Green Town movement. The state of Massachusetts provided money to towns if they would embrace the Green Town concept, the Green City movement. And it required the towns do certain things that, amongst other things, accelerate their environmental building code stuff, level amounts of insulation and this, that, and the other. So there was a town forum on that issue, and the conservationist people came, and of course they spoke very much in favor of it. A person from the real estate industry came and spoke against it, and someone from the building trades spoke against it. And he said, this is just the beginning of an attack against the building trades, because if we have to meet higher and higher environmental standards, it's going to hurt our industry. And after it was over, I went up to him and said, if the state passes more rigorous environmental standards and they make it mandatory that if you sell a house, you have to upgrade your house to the new standards, this will be a boon to your industry and not a hindrance to it, because it'll provide jobs upgrading those homes. And he couldn't see it because he could only see
new construction. Yeah.
So it's hard.
One thing you mentioned, you have an involvement with rescue for marine animals, right?
Right.
Tell me about that.
It turns out that there are certain areas, well, I'll talk about the whales, small dolphins and porpoises first. There's certain areas in the world where there's an excessive amount of beaching of dolphins and porpoises and whales. One of them's in New Zealand, and one of them's or Australia, one of those two places, and one of them's in Japan, and one of them is Wellfleet, Massachusetts, and the Wellfleet in Easton. So we get a lot of dolphin strandings. And what happens is the dolphins get, where we live, very fast by Nova Scotia standards, not a huge tide, but by our standards, it's an 8 to 10 foot tide, but it's very quick. So it goes so that the dolphins come in searching for food, and then the tide goes out, and then they get stranded. And so what we do is pick them up and get them. It depends. There's lots of one thing's put them back in the water and get them out, herd them out. The other thing we do is load them up in vans and take them to deeper areas to let them out, so that they don't restrand. So that's what we do. But we also gather data on mammals that die. So I focus mostly on dolphins and porpoises, but we also do seals.
There seems a perversity about those strandings. I mean, I've seen them with pilot whales, for example, and they seem determined to be stranded. It seems they almost resist going back out to sea.
Well, there's a lot of speculation. Nobody knows for sure what it is. But one thing it seems to me, and from having done it for a while, is that they're very social animals. And they don't want to leave each other. So if some are stranded, the others will stay there and won't leave because they're trying to stay together, to protect each other, which is one reason why we try to move them to a different place and then re-release them as a group so that they don't just follow someone back to stranding. Why the initial ones are stranding, we don't know. But you're right, they do.
It's a beautiful, tragic instinct, isn't it? To stay together at the cost of your own life.
Yeah. It is, and you get very emotionally attached to these animals because you're with them for long periods of time as you try to keep them, protect them from seagulls and crows and getting sunburn, and then you lift them in these vans and take them out and release them. So
it's a lovely thing to do.
It is. It's a very exciting thing to do.
The other hopeful area that you've been working on that I want to talk a little about is the evolution of social movements. And I recently read Paul Hawken's comment on the environmental movement, that it's the largest altruistic social movement in the history of the world. But that the very first one was the abolitionists, which wasn't really very long ago. And you've done some real studies as to how that instinct with the abolitionists flowered into a whole bunch of other things. Tell me about that.
Well, it started out with I did a book on New England environmental activism in the 19th century, and the end of the 18th through to the beginning of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. And one of the people who was very active in the Board of Health, which was concerned about the quality of the environment in terms of clean air, clean water, clean soil, and healthy environment for people to grow up in, was an old abolitionist. So I really wanted to and he was a respected physician, so I was really interested in looking at him as a physician who was very active in the abolitionist movement, because he was not a professional abolitionist. Most of what we know about the abolitionists is from the profession, the people whose job it was to be, Frederick Douglass and Phillips and Garrison and that crowd. So I started reading him, and the more I read him, the more I kept realizing that the abolitionists were obviously fighting against slavery, but in their fight against slavery, they were creating a social movement, and they were thinking in terms of how do we create this large social movement to affect change, fundamental change. And then I started reading a lot about the history of abolitionists, and the more I read about the history of abolitionists, the more I felt that the people who had written about it, most of them hadn't ever been in a social movement. And I happened to have been in a social movement, so I had some clue of how these things worked. So that sort of got me interested in the whole process by which the abolitionists were creating this large social movement, how they were balancing personalities and quirks and friendships and loves and everything to create this structure. And the belief system that they, the common belief system that they sort of rested on. And then I wanted to see what happened to these people when slavery ended, because I didn't believe they would just walk away from it, because nobody I knew who was involved in the civil rights movement or in the anti-Vietnam War movement walked away from that. I mean, they kept that sensibility and that sense of politics with them and moved in many different directions. So I started looking at these abolitionists, and sure enough, I found that they did get involved in a lot of things, and they used their networks that they had created during abolitionism to continue, so that when the women got involved in the women's rights movement, they called on their male friends from the abolitionist movement to be supportive and allies in that. And so that's what made me sort of look at how these social movements kind of created a basic understanding of rights, which is really what it was, the idea that they're fundamental rights, and it's the responsibility of the government to defend those fundamental rights, one of which is freedom and liberty. But the more radical abolitionists went on to say, that fundamental right includes a clean environment, clean air, clean water, clean soil. It involves housing. It involves the right to a decent wage and a decent job. Those are fundamental rights that it's the responsibility of the government to protect, and that's sort of where I went with that.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because it's almost as though when the scales drop from your eyes about slavery, you suddenly develop a consciousness of injustice and an understanding of how people get exploited and harmed, and then you see it everywhere.
Right, and on top of that, and this is what I find fascinating, if you don't, your friend's going to remind you. He's going to call up and say, hey, remember when we did that? It's time to get involved again. And I think that happened a lot too, that people who may have wanted to say, oh, I'm done, they got the call. You're not done, we've still got more to do.
Now, people have said that the boomers, who started out as being deeply involved with civil rights and the anti-Vietnam War and racism of various kinds and so on, did walk away from that. That's the criticism of the...
But I think the problem is that people, it's what statisticians call the ecological fallacy. There were a lot of boomers. Not all of them were involved in the struggle for civil rights. Not all of them were involved in the struggle against the war in Vietnam. Most of the people I know who were involved in those activities, I mean, how active they were varied tremendously. I mean, some people continued to be very active for the rest of their lives. Some of them were moderately active, but I don't think the people who were active in the struggle for civil rights, or the people who were active in the struggle for Vietnam, I don't think those are the people who voted for Donald Trump. I think the people who voted, the boomers who voted for Donald Trump were never part of that community of activists.
What we used to call the movement at the
exactly.
time, right?
I just think I think that's why I said the ecological fallacy. There's groups within that don't, just because a large group of people in the boomer generation were social activists, and because a large number of boomers are voting for Donald Trump, don't mean they're the same people.
Not the same people, yeah.
I mean, but that's what my son says. Well, that's an N of one. I mean, that's my experience. So I can't base that on much more than my experience. But I really don't believe that.
But my sense of it is that you're right about that the people I knew and admired who were involved in the movement at that point went on to live very conscientious lives and to be involved with a whole bunch of different things, including extending their sensibility to non-human life,
And most of it's amazing people I know who were committed activists for racial justice will, in a conversation about racial justice, they'll bring up, and Trump appointed, that person at the EPA who's fought. I mean, their sense of the environment is part of that movement is still pretty strong. I mean, there are people who point the finger at me and say, you know, you care too much about the environment, you know, and not enough about people. But most of the people I know think that the two are too intimately connected to be separated.
Yes, and that's very much where, with the work that Chris and I have been doing, we've come out of that with a very strong sense that human beings and the environment are a single thing. And the idea that you could have an economy without paying attention to the environment over the long pull, I mean, you can get away with it for a while, but as you see in the Cape, ultimately the Cape is saying, hey, you know, you got to drink the water.
I'm a historian, so you have to bear with me. I became a historian, I mean, partly, to be honest, because it was easy for me, but partly I became a historian because when I was growing up, when I was in college, you know, the Vietnam War, you know, the civil rights movement was just, well, was ongoing, and the Vietnam War was, I'll go back, civil rights. When I went to Mississippi to do voter registration, one of the things we did is we set up freedom schools to teach people the history of black struggle in this country. I mean, we weren't paid to do that. The kids that came to those schools weren't paid to, they didn't get credit for it. They did it because they believed they had to know their history in order to affect their present. And when the first years of the struggle against the Vietnam War, we had what were called teach-ins. And teach-ins were political. They were protests. They weren't, I mean, some people use the term teach-in pretty loosely now. It's not. What we did was a political act. But what we were doing in that political act was teaching ourselves the history of how we got to Vietnam. Because if we didn't know that, how are we going to extract ourselves from it? And when I got more and more involved in environmentalism, which I got involved in, as I said, because you know, I love fishing. It's important to me. But I realized we need to know the past and how we've used resources in the past, and who's used the resources, and who benefits and who doesn't benefit, if we're going to move forward in the future, because it is, as we've been talking about, it's so complicated. The forces against the environment are so powerful that if we don't have every tool available to us, we're going to lose. And I think an important tool is knowing how we got here.
It's a wonderful conception of history. No, it is, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that one of the things that's very strange often when one gets into these discussions is people don't know. People don't know how they got here. They don't know what the forces are that have shaped their behavior in their lives and their expectations. And I mean, you're right. They get kind of stuck because they don't have that background.
I'll give you one quick example.
Yeah.
One of the things I'm involved in is trying to shut down a nuclear power plant in Plymouth, Massachusetts. The plant's 40 years old. It has all kinds of problems. The design is the same design as the one in Japan, and we think it should be shut down. They don't have the fuel rods aren't well protected, and they're in a dangerous place and everything. And when we point out the fact that, you know, this plant is on the coast and it's the same, you know, design as the Fukushima plant, they go, well, that's Japan and that was an earthquake. And I, as a historian, say, yes, but in 1635, there was a hurricane that created a storm surge that drove 20-foot waves inland, exactly where that plant is. If you're a historian, you know things like that.
John Cumbler, writes one of his students, is talented, committed, fiery, brave, and humble. We interviewed him in Eugene, Oregon, where he delivered a keynote address to the Public Interest Environmental Law Conference, as did I. We interviewed several other presenters at that conference: butterfly expert, naturalist, and author Robert Michael Pyle, musician and composer Eugene Friesen, and Mary Wood, the legal scholar whose work led to the climate change lawsuit by 21 young Americans against their own government. Watch for those interviews later in 2017. For the Green Interview, I'm Silver Donald Cameron.